the first inaugural Anscombe conference, hopefully one of many, on the anniversary of Elizabeth's 100th birthday. We decided this would be like a good opportunity for undergrads and Anscombe society leaders to essentially actually learn about Anscombe. At least at Harvard, we realized we've never read anything by her. We don't really know what she's about, why she's such a big deal, why we're named it after her. So we just thought this would be a really good opportunity for people to really learn about who she is, really in depth. So today we have 3 speakers with us, one more coming. Professor Kent Vogler from UChicago, Dr. Wicks from the Elm Institute, and Professor Doyle from here at Harvard. And we'd really love to have them. So be sure to take advantage of them. They're going to try and do this more seminar style. So they'll talk a little bit about the subject that they've chosen, and then they'll open the floor to hopefully more student discussion and maybe more in-depth looking through the readings. The layout for today, we essentially have 4 talks, one for each speaker. They're each about an hour and a half long, and then there's 30-minute breaks in between each talk. So during those 30 minutes, you can either come up afterwards and talk to them, or do the readings, or just go around Harvard. It's 47 is about as good as it's going to get here. So, and it's a really beautiful campus if you haven't been here before. So just take the opportunity. And I think that's all. Oh yes, we have a line here with Love Fidelity Network. They're the people who make this possible. So they're the ones who use all these nice name tags and also gave us money and actually made this whole idea from a fantasy into an actual concrete thing. So let's give them a round of applause. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'll do logistics then. So there are bathrooms, more for women than for men. But the 2 men's bathrooms are like a one-person use at a time stalls. So there's one all the way down in the basement on a corridor, good luck finding it, and then there's one that's just a little bit past here, but you can always ask for directions. We are serving breakfast all day long, it appears, because there's a lot of food left there. Katie, we will have lunch. We'll bring in lunch and we'll bring in dinner, so all the meals will be brought in. I'll be served over here. But if you want, serve yourself, but try not to disrupt the conversation. I will ask, when we go seminar style and you start asking questions, maybe project that question loudly so the camera can pick it up, because the speakers, of course, have a microphone that can pick up their stuff. But when you ask a question, or maybe our presenters, if you want to rephrase the question of the student condensely, that would be of value, because then we'll have a valuable recording. Talking about recordings, there's a piece of paper in your folders that says you waive all rights to your image, regardless of how popular you become, famous, or whether you're following us, or you're doing this on Instagram, making your own Insta movie. We want rights to, so the date's a little bit wrong, 2018, but aside from that, fairly valid. So I think the best, you're welcome to fill out the form however you choose, but it's just so that you know that if your voice gets captured. But the focus of the filming is to capture the content and then the conversation. We're not going to be profiling anyone. And so I just want you to all be aware that you can hand those in by lunch or something. Logistics. So that's what we'll do this morning, and then we'll keep updating you throughout the rest of the day, the next things. So big round of applause to Will for housing everyone, getting all this coordinated, and making this dream come true.
Cool. So I'll just say one last thing before I hand it off to Dr. Wicks, which is that in addition to the Love Fidelity Network, the Abigail Adams Institute, Danilo will be here later. Oh, James Capuzzi is the representative for now. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute and Christian Union are all pitched in to help pay for the nice food and these fancy folders. So, just be sure to sort of thank them, thank James afterwards. Great. All right. So Dr. Wicks, he, like I mentioned, he's a fellow at the Elm Institute, studied at Oxford and Cambridge before coming across the pond, where he was a graduate fellow at Princeton, before finishing a PhD at Notre Dame in 2010. After his postdoctoral work at Princeton, he taught in the ethics program at Villanova University as a Catherine of Siena Fellow before finally joining the Elms Institute. He does a lot of work in Aristotelian ethical and political thought and the intellectual foundations of utilitarianism. And he has a book on Peter Singer that I'm very curious about.
I have half a book on Peter Singer.
Half a book on Peter Singer, which I'm very curious about. And he's going to give today's first talk on, all right, title's not in front of me, but I believe
it's probably just Anscombe and modern moral philosophy.
Perfect. That's enough subject.
That sounds like what I would have told you. Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Talk is probably overstating things. I mean, my plan is to talk for a few minutes to make a few remarks which I hope will sort of serve as the basis for a discussion. My understanding is that some of you have done a fair amount of Anscombe before, but for most of you, encountering her philosophical works is a sort of new experience, and so I'm particularly eager to sort of get to the discussion quickly to find out what questions you have. I feel somewhat intimidated. I'm flanked on either side by real experts on Anscombe, so hopefully they'll help me out if I look like I'm drowning. But I think I can at least give you a sort of orientation that sort of highlights some of her significance and maybe some areas that would be good to dig into. So there are, I think we're here partly because there are two Anscombes in a way, that there's been two separate revivals of interest in her work. One in academic philosophy, and one within the broad university community by people who are interested in Anscombe primarily as a representative of a traditional and these days rather unfashionable set of views about sexual ethics and other related issues. And so one remark is just what these two things have to do with one another. It's not a complete coincidence that she's occupied these two different roles, and I think her eminence as an academic philosopher gave her a certain stature as a figurehead, as a sort of modern representative of, as I say, traditional and to some degree unfashionable ethical teachings. But it is quite remarkable that in philosophy, the timing of the sort of revival of interest does roughly coincide with the founding of Anscombe societies and things like that. Not that people weren't reading her before, but there was definitely a sort of uptick of interest. There was a period where, at least to many people, she was somewhat in the shadow of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who she was initially a student and then a friend, later translator, literary executor, and Wittgenstein was a very domineering personality. The story was at Cambridge, people started dressing like Wittgenstein, adopting his mannerisms, partly affectation, but partly just people imitate strong personalities. And there are some respects in which Anscombe is clearly influenced by Wittgenstein's style. But as time has gone on, I think there's been an increased appreciation of her original contributions. Wittgenstein didn't write very much explicitly about ethics, and what he did write is kind of complex. It's difficult to know quite how it fits in with the rest of his thought. And Anscombe dug much deeper into certain topics than Wittgenstein ever did in his published writings. So I think now she's rightly recognized as an original and pioneering thinker, despite the fact that she's obviously closely associated with him. One other sort of remark about situating her is, one quick version is to say that she stands behind the revolution in ethical theory, which is described as the rise of virtue ethics. While I wouldn't go so far as to say that's wrong, I think it's not a terribly helpful description, because it can lead you to believe that her signal contribution is getting people to think about virtue again. But I think the most interesting thinkers who bear this label tend to be people for whom, while virtue is an important category, it's very much part of a set. And so her argument in modern moral philosophy, several decades later, becomes a crucial inspiration for Alistair MacIntyre's argument after virtue. But despite the title, what MacIntyre is doing isn't trying to revive a lost notion of virtue. It's trying to show that Aristotelian ways of thinking about ethics are a live option in the modern world. Now, you can't be an Aristotelian without thinking that virtue is important, but if you're trying to sort of describe how Aristotle thinks about ethics, virtue is only going to be one of a number of key terms, and I don't even think it's necessarily the best term to start with. So, again, I think to say that Anscombe is a crucial source behind virtue ethics is not wrong, but that might just be not the best way of thinking about sort of what she did. And one other category to sort of get us started is absolutism. Absolutism these days has rather negative connotations. It can sound like sort of black and white thinking, everything goes into one or the other of two categories. But within ethical theory, at least one established way of using the term is to describe the belief that there are some types of action which are wrong always, regardless of the circumstances or the consequences. So that doesn't tell you everything is black or white. It just tells you there are some options, some types of action that a human being might perform where the answer to the question, should I do this, is always no. Believing that is entirely compatible with believing there are other rules that apply only sometimes and for the most part. It can allow that circumstances can make a difference, the consequences can be relevant. It just says, out of the gate, certain choices are ruled out, morally speaking. So that's going to be a sort of useful category to hang on to. One of Anscombe's preoccupations, I mean, she was an outspoken defender. She was pro-life. She was an outspoken defender of traditional ethics of sexual fidelity and chastity. But another crucially important set of moral issues for her concerned the ethics of killing in war. And here it's important to remember her historical context. As a young woman, she witnessed the Allies in the Second World War systematically and massively violate the tradition of non-combatant immunity. This isn't just a matter of using atomic weapons, though those are weapons which by their very nature are indiscriminate between combatants and non-combatants. It was also before that the use of carpet bombing, or sometimes known as annihilation bombing techniques, where conventional bombs were dropped in such magnitude that they indiscriminately destroyed large areas of German cities. And she regarded this as morally indefensible. It's a good example of her absolutism. The traditional moral absolute is not thou shalt not kill. One clue that that can't be the right translation is right after, in the Ten Commandments, the commandment that says thou shalt not kill, there's a long list of things that people should be put to death for. So that's a clue, right? So the traditional rule is that human beings are by default innocent and not legitimately killable. But there are certain ways in which that status can be forfeited. One is through committing crimes or sins so grave that they warrant capital punishment, and hence the Old Testament prescriptions regarding capital punishment. And the other is through being directly engaged in the process of attacking somebody unjustly. It's not, on this traditional view, that soldiers who shoot other soldiers are executing them. It's not punishment. But while you're engaged in attack, you forfeit the status of innocent. And that's why enemy soldiers, at least in the context of a just war, have been regarded as legitimately targetable in a way that non-combatants have not. And hence, for her, she can be an absolutist without being a pacifist. And some of her significant sort of applied ethics writings are against pacifism and in defense of a traditional just war ethics, including a very strict demarcation between combatants and non-combatants. So this was a very important issue for her, and one reason why the question of whether there are legitimate moral absolutes is not a sort of question just for the seminar room. It was a pressing issue of public morals. Okay, so that's just a few bits of orienting background and a few key categories. So I wanted to quickly talk through the three theses which she outlines at the beginning of Modern Moral Philosophy and tries to elaborate in that course of that essay, and then pick up on a remark near the end, a quite notorious remark, provocative even within the context of a provocative essay. And then I'll stop and we can sort of do questions and discussion. So Anscombe was a truly brilliant philosopher. I don't think she was a truly brilliant writer. She can be difficult, and sometimes I think she can be unnecessarily difficult. But she does what people are often told to do when they write a philosophy essay, which is she puts her theses right up front. She tells, like, here's the thing I'm going to argue for. So you have three theses clearly stated at the very beginning of the essay. The first is that moral philosophy should be put to one side until we have an adequate philosophy of psychology. Now, there are people who specialize in the philosophy of psychology, but when she's writing, philosophy of psychology is not a sort of major, well-established topic. I mean, there are people who have done things you could describe that way, but it's not a sort of stable and established field. And I think what she's talking about is a set of issues, not all of which would be described as philosophy of psychology if you were to go to the Harvard Philosophy Department in 2019. Crucially, she's interested in questions of what it is to have a reason to act, and the role that intention plays in understanding and describing human action. So her classic book is a thin but dense and difficult volume called Intention. And if you want to really do Anscombe, there's no way to do it but going through that book. It will be rewarding, but it'll make you work. It's a tough book. But it's a tough book partly because it's a tough topic. She thinks it's easy to specify some ways in which our thinking about human action is going wrong and is kind of muddled, but it's quite hard to develop a sort of robust sense of what it is to act intentionally, and so how intention works. So this essay is kind of setting up the motivations for that project, which will preoccupy a lot of her writings going forward. The second thesis, the concepts of moral obligation and moral duty ought to be jettisoned if this is psychologically possible. This is one of the ways in which her thesis is an inspiration for Alistair MacIntyre, who, in After Virtue, says that we've kind of inherited this notion of moral duty that is a source of mystification because it's become detached from its original context. So this isn't saying you can't have ethics without God, but it is to say that for a long time, ethical thinking in the Western tradition was strongly informed by a theological worldview. And as God is no longer part of the common assumption that people share, there are some respects in which there's an inertia which is carried forward, patterns of thought that don't make sense without a certain kind of theological underpinning. There's something quite Nietzschean about this thesis. Again, this might not be helpful if you've not done Nietzsche, but sort of one of Nietzsche's core theses is that people think they've given up on believing in God, but they haven't yet fully seen through the consequences of that revolution in thought. Now, he's coming to that thesis from the point of view of somebody who thinks, well, clearly there is no God, and it's high time we complete the revolution. But there are people who can actually accept the first half of what Nietzsche's saying, and they just go the other way when it splits. And they'll say, well, actually, I do believe in God. But I think Nietzsche's right in thinking there are people who don't, who are sort of still trading on ideas that don't make sense in the absence of a theistic worldview. So the thought is not to sort of jettison ethics, but to say, why don't we try to just do without the term moral and see how we go, and see if some of our confusions seem to drop away. I'll give you one illustration. This is mine, not hers, but I think it sort of points in the direction of what she's thinking about. People can sometimes disagree about whether doing a certain thing is morally right or morally wrong. But there are times when they can agree, and yet disagreements arise a little bit further downstream. Or maybe we might say disagreements are revealed that have their origin further upstream. So sometimes people will say, this is wrong, hence we shouldn't do it. Like, end of story, just it's wrong, so we shouldn't do it. But sometimes you'll find people say things like, well, look, sometimes in life you have to do something which is wrong. The mistake is to think that morality always takes priority, that morality always trumps. It's just part of the human condition that in this world, sometimes the right choice is a morally wrong action. And then people kind of stare at each other and they get a little bit stumped because they don't know where to proceed from there. One party to the dispute regards it as just kind of axiomatic, part of what it is to grasp the concept of the moral, that it takes priority. Once you've decided something is morally wrong, you've kind of closed the question of whether it should be done. Whereas other people regard that question as live and rather pressing. The question of how moral reasons and moral obligations relate to other reasons we have to act is a difficult one, and not one that can be sort of settled by any rule so simple as saying moral obligations always take priority. And those disputes can be even more baffling than disputes about, say, the morality of capital punishment or abortion or killing in war. Anscombe thinks our puzzlement is partly this inheritance we don't fully understand. And then finally, and perhaps most notoriously, she says the difference between the well-known English writers in moral philosophy since Sidgwick are of comparatively little importance. And this is related to this notion of absolutism that I mentioned earlier. She thinks, so Sidgwick was the greatest utilitarian thinker. There are sort of, if you do the canon of 19th century, the question of kind of where utilitarianism starts is a disputed one. But in the 19th century, there's a string of three thinkers: Bentham, political reformer, powerful rhetorician, philosophically pretty weak. John Stuart Mill, who is raised, quite literally educated from childhood, to be a powerful advocate for utilitarian moral reform. And in his autobiography, he sort of talks about this very peculiar education he received at the hands of his father, a close friend and associate of Bentham. And he is a better utilitarian, partly through being a rather more inconsistent utilitarian. He felt the limits of the theory and tries his best to sort of make it a richer view of ethics within the framework and what it allows. But Sidgwick, who's writing in the last part of the 19th century, is head and shoulder above them just philosophically. And he writes this book called The Methods of Ethics, which goes through 7 editions. And it's not just correcting typos. I mean, he's constantly working through the arguments of the book. And part of his greatness is he's acutely aware of the challenges of utilitarian thought. People who do the history of 20th century analytic philosophy often put G. Moore at the very beginning of the 20th century. He wrote an ethical book called Principia Ethica as like the first major thinker in analytic ethics. But in a lot of ways, Sidgwick is sort of anticipating. I mean, the style of writing is recognizably sort of continuous with what a lot of mainstream moral philosophy looks like in the 20th century. However, because the book is big and difficult, he's just not read nearly as much as Bentham or Mill. There's a good chance you do undergraduate philosophy classes, you'll read some Mill. You probably won't read much Bentham, maybe a few excerpts. But the problem with Sidgwick is it's so big, it just doesn't fit in the undergraduate syllabus without taking up most of the space. And it's a real shame. So he's a sort of pioneering academic moral philosopher. And then from that point, you can sort of point to his successors. Who are the major thinkers who people are responding to? And if you're taught philosophy, you're taught these as the major teams. You have to sort of choose your side. Are you going to go with Sidgwick or Moore? Or there's these people called the intuitionists, W.D. Ross and actually a number of other thinkers. And so your sense of like what it is to do moral philosophy is to kind of choose which of these teams you think has the better case, the better theory. And so it's deeply irreverent, deeply provocative. And in Anscombe, she enjoyed being provocative, so like, she's well aware of this. To say, look, all these things you're squabbling about really aren't very important. Yes, there are differences between these views, but what they have in common is far more important than what separates them. And one of the crucial things they have in common is none of them can support moral absolutes of the sort which were fundamental to the way we thought about ethics until the day before yesterday. That's a huge revolution. And because it's shared by the different parties of the debates going on in your seminar rooms, you haven't noticed it. You haven't been struck by how deep a change in the way we think about ethics that is. So that's what she's trying to get at. And you have these one-paragraph dismissals, which, like, she knows people are going to be mad about this. Right? People devote their life to sort of studying Kant, and she comes along and takes care of it in about 4 sentences. Well, it's meant to be a provocation, and I think she's not really expecting to persuade people with the particular argument she's deploying. That's not really the point. The point is kind of to get them mad, but also the point is to invite them to seriously consider that there might be an option on the table that they haven't noticed yet. So, sorry, I was going to wrap this up rather quickly, but this will be the last point, and we can do discussion. So I think the thing she's trying to do is this. To say that when you have your modern representatives of utilitarian thought, your sort of modern representatives of Kantian thought, this kind of intuitionism which says that ethics is about balancing different considerations, different values, different sort of apparent obligations, and figuring out which ones take priority in any given case. Each of those views, when you really get down to it, tends to derive its persuasive force by ruling out the other options around the table. So Kantians tend to proceed by showing you everything which is wrong with utilitarianism, everything is wrong with intuitionism, and so on. And this, well, hence Kant wins as the last man standing. And that's a perfectly legitimate kind of argument, provided you know that your list of the possibilities is complete. If it has to be A, B, or C, and you can show it can't be A or B, that's a good argument for saying it's C. But the premise that says it has to be A, B, or C is really doing crucial work there. So I think she says, look, sophisticated moral philosophers are not unaware of the challenges each of these views face. As I say, the best of them are acutely aware. Sidgwick has a very deep sense of the problems utilitarianism faces. But when it gets down to it, their allegiance depends upon the thought, but somehow this has to be right because it can't be those other things. And so if we had reason to believe we could think like Aristotelians, and although she's not going to say this in her context, like Thomists, I mean, Aquinas is an important influence for her, but in the rooms she's used to sort of speaking in, Aristotle's the sort of the safer go-to. If that turns out to be a live option that has been illegitimately left off the list, suddenly things look very different. And suddenly difficulties that utilitarians and Kantians were used to just dealing with and saying, well, this is, it's a difficulty, but somehow there must be a solution, might actually come to be seen as fatal flaws. So that's part of the agenda of the essay. I tried to give you some background for those who just don't know the story without sort of boring those who sort of have done quite a lot of 20th century ethics. But I've talked for longer than I planned to, so let me stop now and ask if you have any questions, any thoughts, any responses to what was in the essay.
You've got a hand over here.
Oh, yes.
So, Anscombe talks a bit about huge moral theory and everything, especially on reason being like a slave.
Yeah.
Right? And so she talks about like necessity and how that's not really too connected to desires or anything.
Yeah.
But when she talks about the need for sort of psychological basis, doesn't that kind of undermine her case? Because doesn't that, in a sense, reduce ethics to a sort of mental state?
Well, I mean, So she's not going to have a picture which is anything like Hume's, right? So with Hume, the baseline is, as you say, sort of psychological. People just sort of, they want certain things, they have certain desires, certain passions, he would say. Actually, if you want to get the better version of this kind of view, it's not in Hume, it's in Smith, whose theory of the moral sentiments kind of structurally has a lot in common with Hume, but it's very rich in the way it sort of plays that out, and in doing so, helps to show how you could bootstrap morality out of normal human concerns, as he puts it, not just to be loved, but to be lovely. We don't just want people to approve of us, we want people to approve of us for kind of the right kind of reasons. We want to sort of act in ways that really merit approval. But for Anscombe, that can't be the baseline. For her, reasons aren't. Reasons are sort of there in the world. There are things that give us reasons which don't depend on what we happen to want at any given time, and that's the thing Hume can't really ever properly account for. And Candace, do you want to sort of add anything here? Or this is a good question, but it goes deep.
It goes deep. Look, there's a just talking. It's kind of funny. There's kind of a strong sense in which when Hume is doing psychological things, it's like there's bits of mental furniture that are actually getting moved around in various kinds of ways. And looking at the ways these all hook up and how you got your impressions and you got your reflections and all those things. Anscombe does not think that that's a decent picture of the mind. She's strongly anti-empiricist in that sense. I mean, that's part of the linkage with Wittgenstein, actually. So when she's doing philosophy of psychology, in the sense she means, she's writing that monograph called Intention, right, where it's as much about the structure of an action, the means-end structure of an action in the first place, that you're getting your psychology off of an understanding of practical engagements, and you're having as much psychology as you need for that, rather than trying to conjure up practical engagements out of a bunch of stuff in my head that shoots out my hand and then results in my picking up a sadly empty coffee cup. Right. So Hume is a guy who's trying to make mental contents zoop out into the world in some way. For Anscombe, you're starting already with engagement in the world, and you're taking such psychology as you need from that, but the sense of the psychology you're taking comes from your analysis of how things work with our engagements with the world. Does that help?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for being here. I was wondering, it seems to me that Anscombe was trying to take a common objection to absolutism, which is like, it's so black and white, it's so focused on like just saying these things are definitely wrong, and like that's where it ends. It seems she was trying to turn that on utilitarianism and say it almost had a focus on an overemphasis on like what not to do rather than what to do. So I was wondering if you could speak on whether that's...
Yeah. So a couple of things have come into my head, and I'll say them, and then you can tell me whether they're sort of actually responsive to your question. So one is, absolutism is not the name of a theory of ethics or a sort of ethical worldview. It's sort of a feature shared by a number of ethical theories and ethical worldviews. So to say someone is an absolutist is not to describe everything they think about ethics. It's just to say one feature of their way of thinking about ethics is to believe that there are some types of action which are just always ruled out. And as I say, that's compatible with saying there are other rules that don't work that way. It's not saying everything is black or white. It's just saying there are certain things you never get to do. And that, by the way, is why utilitarianism is not an absolutist moral theory, even though it rules out all kinds of choices all the time. Indeed, it's notorious, in its kind of simplest forms, it's notoriously demanding because it's a maximizing rule, an exceptionless rule. Wherever you are, under any circumstances, you should act so as to maximize aggregate welfare, total happiness, however you're going to describe it. But it's always an open question what the course of action in your situation will be that will lead to the maximum. So choices are always black and right. There's always a right answer. Occasionally, you might imagine there being a tie, where there are a couple of options which will sort of do equally well, but that's usually going to be fairly rare. So it's not absolutist, but it's very black or white. There's always, the right or the wrong thing to do, even if you can't always tell. In fact, probably you can never really tell because, the consequences that matter extend to infinity. So yeah, she's trying to turn the table on utilitarianism. She's criticizing it for not being absolutist. This is also tied to her proposal to just do away with the notion of the moral and just drop the word. So she says, near the end, if we sort of drop the question, could it ever be morally right to prosecute somebody we knew who was innocent for the sake of public peace or something like that? That can feel like a genuinely difficult question. We can imagine the hard case. What if there's a potential riot and other people will predictably die? Could we make this one person suffer, knowing that they didn't do the thing they're accused of, just because we have no confidence we could persuade the mob otherwise? There are real cases which sort of have that quality. And she says, if you don't ask that question, but ask, could it be just to knowingly prosecute this person who we know didn't commit the crime? The answer is obviously no. So the core of justice is giving people what is due to them. This is why desert is such a crucial notion in criminal law. It's not the only notion, but it's kind of vital to the whole process. And she says, there can be no, you've answered the question by describing the situation. This person is innocent. Obviously they don't deserve to be punished. And so virtue language, she thinks, it doesn't float free in the same kind of way. But did that actually, I think that the things I've just said are sort of true of Anscombe, but did it speak to the question?
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit of a follow-up.
Sure.
Is her objection also that it seems like this can be an objection to whatever absolutism, or at least the perception of it, is that there's less emphasis on what one should do and more on just what you shouldn't. And so there's less.
Yeah. Well, so when people criticize sort of absolutist views, that is one of the ways in which they criticize it, and that is why it's important to sort of say it's a component of a way of thinking about ethics. It's not the whole of it. It can be true, just as a matter of descriptive fact, that some people sort of dwell a lot on the absolute prohibitions in ways that can make their way of thinking about ethics unattractive. Early on in my remarks, I said I think rather than thinking of Anscombe as sort of standing behind the rise of virtue ethics, it's better to see her standing behind the revival of Aristotelianism. And Aristotelianism is a way of thinking about ethics which starts with the notion of a flourishing human life, the human good. And ultimately, accounts of why we shouldn't do certain things are tied to accounts of the good. So it's a positive view. Morality can come to seem like it's very constraining. You have all these possibilities, and the first thing it does is rule these things out. I think moral views do rule things out, but I also think sort of helping people to sort of get away from the picture where they see it primarily as a series of finger-wagging prohibitions. I think it was Dorothy Parker said the problem with the Ten Commandments is it just gives you ideas. There's a way in which if you start with a thou shalt nots, morality can seem like it's constantly getting in the way of your fun. Aristotle and Aquinas will give you quite rich psychological descriptions. Aquinas especially, of the human goods which are thwarted by the violation of these prohibitions. I think, but also we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. That modern moral philosophy is an intervention saying we've got a lot of work to do, and she would go on herself to do some of that work. But it's not like secretly she has at the time she writes this whole view, and she's just kind of keeping a lot of it's sort of secret. She's trying to make people feel the force of a certain kind of criticism in the hope they'll be open to a more fruitful way of exploring ethics. Sure. Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the difference between using moral language and saying things like unjust or unchastened other, like on whatever which that she talks about. Aren't those also like
Well, so what she's suggesting we try to do without is, rather than saying moral language, it's actually just the word moral, used as a category. So people will sometimes, you can sometimes say like that's wrong, and people sometimes, but is that a moral judgment or a practical judgment or a something else judgment? It's that kind of assumption that we can sort of categorize things into moral and non-moral that she thinks is a source of a lot of confusion. So part of what it would be to follow this proposal is to reject the question, but aren't justice and chastity and fidelity moral terms? Because they said, well, as opposed to what? I mean, they're terms that matter, they have importance, but why assume that we can take every judgment a human being makes and put it into column A or column B, where column A is for the moral judgments and column B is for the other judgments? And I mean, we're so used to doing that, it doesn't feel like it's a sort of terribly difficult thing. And there are some cases, well, obviously this is a moral judgment, obviously this is a non-moral judgment. But she says, when you then ask people to kind of explain how they're drawing the distinction and what follows from it, they'll start to get puzzled. And that's a puzzlement she thinks we can do without. If you replace the thought considerations of justice are moral judgments with the question, why does justice matter to us? Why should we care? That's still going to be a difficult question, but it's a question she thinks we can get some traction with. It's a less mystifying question.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I suspect an important aspect of the issue here also is the contrast between our understanding of the idea of moral virtue and the conception of virtue that Anscombe had in mind, which is fundamentally Greek. That is, I mean, more specifically Aristotelian, but most importantly Greek. And the importance of that is just that on the Greek conception, it's of the essence of virtue, that it's a quality that you can't live well without, right? So skeptical questions along the lines of, but why should I care about being chaste or about being just, etc. They basically betray conceptual confusion because it belongs to the idea of virtue, that it's part of the equipment of living well. That's not to say that skeptical questions can't be asked, but the skeptical questions then concern what the content is of the virtue, in the way that Callicles asks such skeptical questions in Plato's Gorgias. But one way I put it in my ethics course, history of ethics course, is that on a modern moral conception of virtue, if you have a virtue, then by definition it's good news for the people around you. It's kind of an open question whether it's good news for you. But with the Greek conception, it's the other way around. It's by definition good news for you, but it's an open question, as in the Callicles case, whether it's good news for everyone else.
That's actually very helpful, and also it, for a number of reasons, one of which is actually reminds me of something else I wanted to say, so there's one more remark I wanted to make, which I initially planned to say when I started, which is in this very provocative essay, one of the most provocative claims is where she says, if somebody really believes it's an open question whether it could be the right thing to do to secure the prosecution of an innocent man, I don't want to argue with him. He shows a corrupt mind. And so this is another part of the Aristotelian conception that makes virtue partly constitutive of a life well lived. So the problem with being untruthful is not just that it has bad consequences, but honesty in our relations amongst others is partly constitutive of a life lived well in community. So there's no open question about whether you could sort of get to a good outcome through lying. Compare Mark Twain, who says, it's always the best policy to tell the truth unless you're an exceptionally gifted liar. For most people, honesty is probably the safe approach. But if you're really crafty about it, you could sort of do very well through lying. Aristotle would just say that shows a deficient understanding of what it is to do well in life. Any conception of your flourishing where you could sort of get there through dishonesty is thereby deficient. But the bit I wanted to add is one of the reasons this is so provocative is it shows a certain modesty in her sense of what philosophy can do for you. So part of the Greek conception is you learn to internalize a sense of why virtue is necessary that won't necessarily be sort of available to people who don't share those virtues. So virtues aren't just dispositions to act badly; they're partly failures to sort of apprehend, act well. So yes, that was a bit calculus. But the part of what it is to be virtuous is to understand the point of being virtuous, and this is why people who are cowardly often have difficulty distinguishing genuine bravery from a kind of foolhardy rashness. People who are dishonest often regard honest people as kind of mugs. And Aristotle thinks, look, if you haven't been brought up to see the point of acting in these ways, probably no argument is going to persuade you, because the argument doesn't have enough to work with yet. So at one point he says, if you're disposed to sort of act this badly, you need to be sort of punished rather than persuaded. And that's a pretty incendiary thing to say to moral philosophers who are often accustomed to having the thought, well, one day someone's going to come into the seminar room and put this argument on the board and it's going to settle the question. We might have to wait a long time. Most of the results we get seem to be negative. People are very good at finding objections to this argument. But sooner or later, we'll find, here's the reason why you should be moral, and here's the reason why morality requires you to do this and this and not this. But she says, no, reasoning of the kind philosophers do has its value, but it comes in very late in the process. And if it doesn't come in for people who are well-formed in their ethical thinking, it can clarify the thinking of vicious people, but it won't help them see why they should be virtuous. I think that's a more realistic conception of what reason can in fact do, but you can see why moral philosophers wouldn't like it on the whole. Yes?
To your comment, if I understood the writing correctly, it said that the primary source of virtue was a good upbringing. So is that correct, that she doesn't believe there's any native ability to have virtue?
Well, there's a native capacity. So in this respect, she is very Aristotelian, and I think in modern moral philosophy, she doesn't go very far into this, so we have to kind of fill out the picture as an Aristotelian would fill it out, which is babies are neither virtuous nor vicious. They're just kind of creatures of appetite. They want certain things, not other things. And part of a good upbringing, it kind of prunes and develops their appetites. And if it's a good upbringing, it does so in ways that habituate them to acting well. But sometimes you have to act well before you come to act well for the right kind of reasons. So sometimes you have to be kind of made to share before you can learn to be truly generous. And on this picture, to be truly generous is not just to act in a certain way, but it's to act in a certain way from the right kind of motivation. So there are some people who share, who give to those who need it, but they do so kind of grudgingly. You know, you can have this, but I want to hang on to it. Whereas a truly generous person takes a certain pleasure in acts of generosity. A just person likes to be just. Somebody who's temperate in their appetites is very different from the person who is trying to eat healthier, but it's a constant struggle. Now, it's better to be doing the right thing even with some psychological struggle, even with some self-control. But the sense of the place you're trying to get to is a place where there's a kind of neat alignment between your motivations and what virtue requires of us. So eventually, when things go well, kind of things line up in the Humean way, that your actions kind of flow from your motivations. But there's a standard here that Hume has no space for, which is just whatever you happen to want, there's a sense of what an excellent person would do. But one of the things that makes this quite attractive is the life of virtue is a life of people doing what they want to do. The rule isn't do whatever you want, but virtuous people want to do excellent things. Yes?
Where would Anscombe want to source kind of any kind of table or list of virtues from? What sort of principles which would like to either be possibly derived from or at least backed up once you've found the other means?
I'll say something, but I'll be very pleased to have help on this one. I mean, I think this is related to the previous question insofar as she wants not to start with the picture that a bunch of adults get around the table and then sort of, okay, we've got a whiteboard, let's get some virtues on the board, as if we were new to this. You know, I mean, you've been learning about virtue since you were a child. So we're not populating a list of virtues as a sort of novel academic exercise. Well, what characteristics were you encouraged to cultivate in your action? Now, if the question is why, if we're challenged, somebody says, but why be honest, for example? Have you considered the merits of not being honest? You know, I think we shouldn't have some sort of abstract sense of what a good answer to that would look like. For an Aristotelian or for a Thomist, sooner or later you'll be talking about the goods of a human life. But that language of goods can sometimes be an obstacle to actually having a rich conversation. So sort of, I mean, you know, in Aristotelian terms, we will be talking about goods, but that actually might not be the best language to use to try and convey it, because some people just don't speak that language in the same way. One of the sort of dangers of a philosophical training is you get so comfortable with a certain vocabulary that it can just seem to you like it's kind of there to be read off the world. And even if you think it actually is responding to truths about the way the world is, it can be as much of an impediment to sort of revealing it to others as it can be an aid. But I'd be happy to have help on this one if either of you.
I think she's more of a Thomist than an
Okay.
Aristotelian in various respects. And there are some very important differences between the two, even though Aquinas was obviously deeply indebted to Aristotle. Aquinas was required in various ways to have a bigger constituency for his moral philosophical writings than Aristotle was. For one thing, Aquinas had to be able to deal with Augustine, who was pretty fully formed at a point when he made a very big shift in his understanding of the moral contours of the world. And Aquinas is answerable to the whole catalog of saints, canon of saints in his day, almost none of whom were beautifully educated and intellectually inclined aristocratic young men. One of the most important of whom, for a Dominican like Aquinas, is actually a female person who's not particularly spectacularly well educated or intellectually inclined. Okay. So and he's got a different understanding of the character of virtue, one that I think Anscombe is very deeply indebted to, where virtue is corrective. There are ways in which we're out of balance, sort of from the get-go. And whatever's going on with cultivation of virtue, it's supposed to promote a certain kind of harmonious work of our various powers. Okay, so there's a number of Aristotelians who hate that feature of Aquinas because they're like, no, there's no disadvantage from the get-go. But if you think there was a fall, and you're like a friend to somebody like Chesterton who thinks that it's the only bit of the Bible that requires no special support, such as obvious on reading the newspaper, that you're dealing with creatures who are operating ordinarily in unbalanced ways, then, I think Anscombe actually thought we were kind of shabby. It's one of the things I love about her. And so, does Oxford moral philosophy corrupt the youth? Well, that would suppose that the youth were in okay shape before they arrived.
Yeah. That's true. Although she does, so she clearly does believe in original sin, and she does believe sort of this is a deep fact about human life. But in that essay, she also thinks there's a new element of corruption which has entered in. But the Oxford moral philosophers aren't to blame. It's sort of the modern world is to blame. One way of putting this would be Aristotle believes people can do the wrong thing, and sometimes they can do the wrong thing knowing it's the wrong thing. Like the wrong appetite wins out in some sort of struggle. But what he doesn't seem to have space for is doing the wrong thing because it's the wrong thing. And there's a kind of prideful disobedience in the notion of sin in Christianity, which doesn't have an analog in his way of thinking. One other thing just to watch out for here is in philosophy, people so often explain themselves by reference to the thinkers they're formed by, but it's often unclear what the rules are for sort of how close you have to be to sort of claim a thinker. And so some people who describe themselves as Aristotelian are taking a lot more from Aristotle than certain others. I'm kind of quite a broad church Aristotelian. Like, you don't have to share much beyond the sort of core framework for me to sort of find that a useful term, whereas I think there are others who use it to mark out actually importing quite a lot of the detail of what he thinks. And then, you could argue about sort of where the line should be drawn, or you can just kind of keep an eye out, and if somebody sort of uses a thinker, just sort of, ask them, but does that mean you kind of follow this thinker in this respect, in this respect, in this respect? But certainly the view of Aquinas that says Aquinas is basically you just get some Aristotle, get some Augustine, and you sort of add water and stir, underestimates how deeply original a thinker he was.
Yes.
But the other slightly complicating factor is, Anscombe was a well-known Catholic convert. She never hid that, but she was mostly working in situations where she didn't anticipate Aquinas having a great deal of currency. And so she is more likely to kind of allude to Aristotle just knowing her audience. And that can be a little bit complicating. Yes?
In knowledge and reverence for human life, what we read for today, Anscombe draws upon Aquinas' notion of connatural knowledge and talks there about this moral upbringing being, or ethical
upbringing being necessary to recognize, say, the dignity of the human person. And here in modern moral philosophy, the example that she brings up is unjust condemnation of things. And you talk about it in absolutism.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what grounds her absolutism. Is it a sort of implicit reliance upon natural law from Aquinas, or can we talk about kind of egoistic dogmatism in this respect with regard to certain actions being absolute?
Well, so she thinks that if somebody is a just person, they will recognize such an obvious injustice as just being something not to be done. For them, it sort of settles the question. But if we imagine some third party saying, but why should I care about that? Okay, I'll grant you it's unjust, but what's so important about justice, especially when there are lives on the line? Then there's a question of kind of what might one say to that person? And the provocation at the end of this essay is to say, well, there's often nothing you can say to that person because their sort of starting point doesn't allow them to be receptive to the kind of reasons you'd have to offer. I mean, there are things you could say, but they wouldn't sort of get traction with somebody who's just looking at the calculation, says, well, look, here's a prediction about the danger that will the damage that will be done if the mob riots and so on. And the point that Candace was alluding to about the difference between Aquinas and Aristotle on, well, one of the differences she alluded to is Aristotle's pretty pessimistic about how much somebody's ethical thinking can be changed in adult life. Like, when we're young, we're very plastic, we're very malleable, we don't start virtuous or vicious. What matters crucially is how we're taught to act. So there's a kind of optimism about what can be done with young children, combined with a deep pessimism about what happens with adults. Aquinas as a Christian has to have room for radical conversion. And he has to have it both because there are particular cases in his mind, but also it's sort of axiomatic to the gospel of Christianity that people can turn themselves around in ways that Aristotle seems just not really to regard as a live possibility. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen as a result of arguments necessarily. Almost certainly it would never be merely a matter of argument, though one could imagine arguments clearing the way in certain respects. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it does suggest that it's not clear there will be any single or simple answer to that question. And indeed, I think while Anscombe, like Aquinas, is optimistic, at least hopeful about the capacity of people to change, she doesn't imagine a philosopher's argument is likely to be the thing that would bring about a sort of moral epiphany. Is that fair?
The road to Damascus was not a point of disputation.
Yes, that's right. I mean,
nor Augustine in the Garden in Milan.
No.
That's absolutely right. Now, in these cases, like, arguments come in both before and after, but there's a crucial moment which is not primarily argumentative persuasion. Yes.
So in your talk at the beginning, you said that one way to interpret her second thesis about needing to jettison or kind of drop talk of moral duty and obligation is that these are leftovers and remnants of the theological divine law sort of view that's now fallen out of favor. Another possible way to read that is that she genuinely means this, and she's directing her attention to the philosophical community. So she's saying, because you got this, you actually should stop using this language. Versus the alternative that we need to actually bring this language back in, but we need a real grounding for it. Of those two readings, which one do you think is the one that she's more trying to put forward?
If I understand you correctly, I think I read her closer to the first of those alternatives. Like, this is a real proposal. Let's genuinely try and do without this and just see what happens. Now, it's a proposal which is sort of grounded in a suspicion of how that will play out, which is, I think she thinks it will help direct our attention in more fruitful directions. Given the context and the group which is sponsoring this, I mean, we could take sexual ethics as an example. I think sexual ethics is a good context where you get that phenomenon where the language of morality can come to seem like a sort of obstacle to things people want to do, which in a sense it is. People want to do a bunch of things they're told you shouldn't. But the picture then becomes, morality is placing constraints on my ability to enjoy life. I think if you want to defend a more traditional sexual ethic, it's a particularly fruitful area to see how far you can get in offering arguments and analysis and just description without using the word moral, and sort of helping people to sort of attend to the way of seeing life that would make certain traditional rules and prohibitions valued and seem valuable. But I did also mention that for her, the ethics of killing is very important. And she thinks one of the ways in which morality is getting us into trouble isn't just it's sort of mystifying and confusing, but it invites people to make the argument that morality is a luxury we can't afford. And this is part of her argument against pacifism. She's worried that sort of the pacifist and the anything goes realist actually help to support each other, not intentionally, but in practice. The pacifist says, look, just war is a terrible thing, and any kind of killing, whether it's a soldier or not, is just never to be done. And then the realist comes along and says, well, you're right. War is hell, and all killing is abhorrent. But the world being what it is, being fallen, there are sometimes you just have to do it. And so morality is nice in situations where we can afford it, but sometimes there's a sort of absolute necessity. And because the moral line has been expanded by the pacifist, everything gets jettisoned. And you end up justifying not just the killing of combatants, but also the killing of non-combatants and civilians. So I think the kind of see how it goes is sincere. It might turn out that we have reasons to reintroduce this language at a later date, but if it's going to be a genuine inquiry, it should be an open question whether this language is going to turn out to be useful.
It seems that if you're going to maintain any kind of absolutism, like it's a semantic issue whether you need moral or not.
Yeah.
You're going to need some kind of language that's universal and extreme in its denotation of certain kinds of acts.
Oh, sure.
And
But
so that's the difficulty that I'm really
but I think she would say that, that's either not a difficulty or it's not a difficulty that the language of morality helps us with. The English sentence, you should never ever murder someone, it is not improved by saying, morally speaking, you should never ever murder somebody, or murder is always morally wrong. Indeed, there's room for evasion in those formulations that isn't there in the original sentence. So I think she certainly doesn't want to suppose that again, absolutism it's not, I didn't invent it, but sort of, it's a term I'm introducing into the essay. It is not improved or supported or buttressed by the actual language of morality. So as I say, I read her as being sincere. She's unequivocal in thinking there are some things which should never be done, but I think she's sincere in thinking the word moral's not going to help us understand why. Again, she thinks it's important that Aristotle doesn't have this term. Now, it's slightly complicated by the fact that the word moral comes from a Latin word, which comes from a Greek word, which is in Aristotle, but it's not doing the same thing that we do with it. It means pertaining to character. So a moral virtue, an ethical virtue, is an excellence of character. But it's not a term that can be used to sort of say, well, is this a moral judgment or or some other kind of judgment. This is a moral value, another kind of value. She has that lovely line. As I say, she can be a difficult writer, but like a lot of difficult writers, she has these sort of moments of brilliance. Kant is the same way. It's hard, and then every now and again you have this great image. And she says, if you try and kind of read back the word moral as we use it into Aristotle, it's like somebody whose jaw is misaligned and their bite doesn't come down correctly. Their teeth don't quite meet. It just doesn't draw lines where Aristotle sees lines that matter. So did that respond to the question? Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. That's a different question than did it persuade you. But I mean, that's how I'm reading her.
Can you explain how Anscombe's view of moral philosophy differs from Kant's?
From Kant's? Well, I think what's a little bit difficult here is in the essay I assigned, she sort of she says some things which give you some clues as to what she thinks about moral philosophy, but she's not really laying out a whole view of how moral philosophy works. The modern moral philosophy of the title is an object of indictment. She's got some complaints about you guys and what you're up to, and she's going to kind of say what they are. And Kant is part of the indictment. You know, he stands behind, one of the schools of thought that she's objecting to. There's also this remark that I've already alluded to that emphasizes the limits of what philosophy can do when we're thinking about morality. It can clarify our thinking, but it can't. No argument can fundamentally bring about a deep reform in the way we think about how we should act. One clear object of complaint of Kant is that he's a good example of how the language, so this does pick up on the previous question, he's a particularly good example of how the language of morality can be mystifying, because he draws such a sharp division between what we might call prudential in the modern sense reasons for action and moral reasons for action. Indeed, for him, what it is to really get morality is to get that we have these unconditional obligations that are wholly separate on an entirely parallel track to reasons grounded in our self-interest. And he doesn't originate that idea, but he's one of the sort of the most stark exponents of this divide. It shows up all over the place. So I mentioned that Sidgwick is the best of the sort of classic utilitarians, and one of his great intellectual virtues is he feels the tension here, and this way in which we sort of struggle to understand the relationship between the things we ought to do, the moral ought, and things which it seems like we have other kinds of reasons for doing. And so for him, there's a kind of schizophrenia in our thinking where we have these two tables of reasons, moral reasons and other kinds of reasons, moral obligations and then prudence. And this is why people who go back to Aristotle or Thomas often find they're sort of confronted with this challenge by representatives of modern moral philosophy. So this is just selfish because your reasons are tied to what it would be good for you to do. And the whole point of morality, in a way, you don't really get morality until you get the mismatch between that kind of justification and moral obligations. To understand a moral duty is to understand that you should do this thing regardless of whether it's good for you or not. That's what a duty is. But the usual rejoinder from the representatives of the older view is to say that stark contrast only works if you have a sort of faulty conception of what self-interest is. And that this gets back to Professor Doyle's point that part of a moral formation is to come to a better understanding of what it would be for you to live well. And a virtuous life is not a life that's good for you as opposed to others. It's a life which is attentive to your good and the goods of those communities of which you are part. And I mean, that can sound overly restrictive. I mean, it also has room for sort of, the goods of others who aren't part of your community. But the point is the kind of rational self-interest and moral obligations as like the two mutually exhaustive categories of reason for action just don't read back into this tradition. A well-formed person doesn't see the world as being divided along that line. Is that fair?
Yeah, can I?
Please do.
I just wanted to add that, I mean, if the question is what are Anscombe's problems with Kant, one of the main ones is that she, and this is relatively straightforward actually, is that she doesn't think that the idea of legislating for oneself makes any sense. Right? She doesn't think it's sort of psychologically difficult or impossible. She thinks it's logically absurd. And this is actually a kind of instance of what one might think of as a kind of a more general Wittgensteinian diagnosis of philosophical ills, whereby people take a certain way of speaking and transplant it from the only contexts which give it sense. And if you think about the idea of legislation, Anscombe thinks that, and she takes this partly from Aquinas too, I think, that you can't even get talk of legislation going unless you have a legislator and people for whom the legislation is being done in a kind of asymmetrical power relation, so that the legislator can draw upon just punitive forces to enforce whatever legislation is being promulgated. And so she thinks that, I mean, the idea of legislating for yourself is totally central to, Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. So, and she thinks that's a non-starter. So it's a pretty fundamental disagreement. And I mean, relatedly, this touches on ways in which Anscombe's at odds with a great deal of recent, i.e. last 300 years, ethics, is that there's a tendency among ethicists that does probably originate with Kant, well, maybe Plato actually, to think that the absolute kind of foundation of ethics has to do with what the requirements or norms are on rational beings as such. And I think this is an important feature of the Aristotelian and Thomistic traditions, is that, as I understand them anyway, that you can't, in a sense, you can't go beyond the human, right? That ethics is a kind of sort of fundamentally non-negotiably human enterprise, and speculation about what kinds of norms would be appropriate for disembodied spirits or whatever is just sort of fantasy. Sorry.
Yes.
So this might be just an obvious question to answer, but it's pretty central in my brain, like my thoughts. Does that mean so if ethics is a human inquiry, aimed at human activities and what's expected of the rational human being, does that mean it changes for ethical answers or ethical evaluations should change with time as human society changes and what's expected of things change?
That's a good. I mean, it's a good question. It's not a. So human society changes. It doesn't follow that human nature changes in a fundamental way. Let me tie that back to the previous question. So, and again, I'm conscious that for some of you this will be sort of things you already know, but for some it might be new. Kant's way of generating morality is based upon human rationality, but really it's based upon rationality as such. And so if we were to encounter an alien species that was vastly different from us, but it was a rational species, it would be subject, members of that species would be subject to moral obligations for the same reasons that we are, in the same way they would have the same mathematics that we do. They just like sort of, there's a strong analogy between the requirements of logic in our theoretical reasoning and the requirements of morality in our practical reasoning. So, you know, if somebody says, you know, if somebody says, you know, you shouldn't lie, so Kant notoriously believes that lying is never justifiable. It's a bit like your math teacher saying you can't divide by 0. You know, you wouldn't respond, well, don't tell me what to do, right? I mean, they're not telling you what to do. They're just alerting you to the fact there's a certain constraint on what you can think in this way. Now, a lot of people worry about whether that works or not, but for our purposes, the important thing is Kant thinks it works. So morality for him is only based on human nature insofar as our nature is as a rational creature. Biology and all kinds of things like that sort of drop out as irrelevant. For understanding what generates morality, it could be that the application of moral rules makes reference to our nature in the same way as it can make reference to circumstances. Kantians, like anyone else, can allow that sort of the application of morality in a desert might involve being very attentive to how we use water in a way it doesn't in, you know, rainy Massachusetts. So there is some room for context to matter and for sort of human facts about how humans are to matter, but it's not doing any work at that kind of fundamental level. Whereas and this is where virtues are important, as I say. I think I'm not wild about the term virtue ethics, but virtues they're certainly doing important work here. They occupy this kind of middle ground where there's a sort of generality to the way we speak, but it is closer to the texture of human life. And so one thinker I'm very influenced by, a contemporary thinker very influenced by Anscombe, I've already mentioned, is Alistair MacIntyre, and one of his more, in academic terms, a book that came out 20 years ago is recent. So one of his more recent books is Dependent Rational Animals. It's a short book. It's very good, and it's a way of trying to offer a certain corrective to the Aristotelian picture. This gets back to sort of Candace's point about Aristotle is writing for kind of well brought up Athenian gentlemen, and he's importing a lot of kind of assumptions that are tied to that context. And so what MacIntyre is trying to do is to show how you could be an Aristotelian while disagreeing with Aristotle about quite a lot of the specifics of what a virtuous person is supposed to look like. And in particular, he says Aristotle has this kind of prejudice in favor of people who are very self-sufficient. So they give to others, but they're very uncomfortable with being the recipients, because to be the recipient involves a certain kind of need and dependency, which Aristotle's not comfortable with. And so what MacIntyre tries to do is to use an Aristotelian framework to fill out a picture of virtue that is much more attentive to the idea that dependency is not something that sometimes happens to us, but is actually a normal part of human life at every stage of life. Although there are some stages of life which have sort of carry with them more dependency than others. For instance, we are very dependent on each other in the way that we think. This is something we're becoming much more aware of now, as kind of the psychological literature on human biases and judgment making is becoming kind of popular science. There's a lot of sort of general knowledge about all the ways in which, you know, the human brain can mislead us. But to some degree, this is telling us things that we already knew. I'm sure most of you have had the experience that you find it much harder to proofread your own work than someone else's. Someone gives you their paper, you can see, oh, this is a problem, this is a problem. But with the paper you've just written, you can't see the spelling mistakes. You're a little bit too close to it. We use other people to help correct us and to alert us to ways in which our thinking is being led astray. And that isn't something to be embarrassed about. That's just part of what it is to be a human. And so there's a kind of virtue in knowing how to be corrected. There's a virtue in being grateful rather than kind of standoffish and resentful if somebody sort of points out an error. And it's a virtue partly because it's a hard thing for humans to do. Like, we're not set up for that to be easy. but it's a kind of excellence which makes possible other kinds of excellence and the achievement of other kinds of good. The scientific method is part of a sort of attempt to institutionalize good norms of correction. Richard Feynman, a great physicist, he's one of these cases where he was both a pioneering physicist as a theorist and also a very celebrated teacher, a very dynamic teacher of physics. And he said, like, the first rule, he's got this famous commencement address he gave at, I think it was Caltech. He said, the first rule is you mustn't fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. We're really good at telling ourselves a story about why this new theory came into our head, fits the data really well. And the reason you need other people is we'll never, by an act of individual heroism, be able to overcome our tendencies towards self-deception. Aristotle has virtually nothing to say about this, but as a framework, you can fill out a picture of human virtue that can be much more attentive to it. And as I say, I think it's satisfyingly close to the ground. Wittgenstein's been mentioned a few times. He had this lovely saying, sort of back to the rough ground, sort of find the traction of human life. And I think Anscombe did inherit that spirit. But some of the places where it comes across are elsewhere in her body of work. Yes?
Another, this is, I think, along the lines of your answer, just another point of view, that if you look at the list of the virtues, right, if you were to go to the Summa, and you would take the list of the virtues and then the sub-virtues, and you start to get to sub-virtues like decorum, tact, good manners. These virtues, in some sense, are everyday virtues.
Yeah.
And then you start to look at different parts of the country, different cultures in the world, or you can see that there's a need to emphasize some virtues in some places, and not so much in the other, because, well, in some places, everywhere there's custom, and custom is kind of formation, and what virtues people take seriously and they don't.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, like, I'm from the Midwest, but when I go to the dentist office here in Boston, everybody says, "Oh, you're so polite." You say thank you.
Yes.
Why? Because there are these sub-virtues, you might say. These sub-virtues that are emphasized more in the Midwest and the South, and not so much in the East Coast. So in other words, there can be if you know the list of virtues, you can see how in different times and places there could be a variable application of them. And also the need for correction of, in order to help, in order for people to rise more to the standard, in a Catholic context, the standard of Christ.
Yeah.
Right, who possesses all the virtues. Right, so there's a way you can say there's a standard, but also in different times and places, there's different need to emphasize different virtues.
Yeah.
Given the formation of the people based on their family, culture, and time.
So that's a really interesting point. I think we're at time, so I'll say something kind of brief as a response, but it won't be fully adequate, which is, I think there are a couple of interesting issues here. One is, as you say, it can be true of cultures that some of them are doing better than others with regard to certain virtues. There's a famous address delivered here at Harvard by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, where he says, one of the most striking features of the modern West is the absence of courage. Now, whether or not that's true, I suspect it is, but for the purposes of this point, we can be agnostic about that. It seems there should be at least room to make that kind of judgment. Like some cultures are just not doing a good job at cultivating the virtues, even by the standards of fallen human nature. But the example you gave is a particularly complex one, because this is a separate point from the point that the same virtue can be specified in rather different ways in different cultural contexts. And sort of politeness and etiquette is a prime example of how much capacity there is for cultural variation. And so I wouldn't want to say that New York is a very polite place, but there is something to be said to the fact that there are just different norms of what politeness requires. And highly dense places can't work very well with norms of interpersonal etiquette that are sort of designed for low population areas. It's like sort of subways are a certain kind of challenge that norms have to be sort of to some degree adaptive from. I remember I read somewhere it was sort of William F. Buckley that he was he was very virtuous specifically in regard to hospitality. And the person who said this was, the essence of hospitality is being sort of attentive to the needs of the people you're hospitable to. And a certain adaptability is built into that. And so norms of etiquette have to have some give to be adaptable to the needs of the people who are actually in the room. And it's a genuinely difficult question. What is a kind of healthy, virtuous, adjustment and adaptation versus when have you just failed to uphold an important norm? And yeah, etiquette is a particularly sort of complex case.
Sorry, on that note, we'll probably wrap it up because we're out of time. But let's give Dr. Wicks a round of applause. All right, so we have a 30-minute break now, and then we'll be back with Professor Vogler. Just two things. One, if you could drop off your little waivers that you signed here before you leave. And then you're free to either do the readings. There's some good spots around here, or just chat, or take a nice stroll. It's up to you. But be back in 30 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's easier to start because I just have to take the temperature of the room. And,
Right.
But
I think that's really good.
it is. Most of my sort of